My mother-in-law told everyone I was after her daughter's money when she was the one stealing from us. So I showed the bank statements at her birthday party. I was holding a stack of bank statements in my lap under the restaurant table when Patricia started her birthday toast about how families should protect each other from people who only want money. 53 people were watching her speak, champagne glasses raised, completely unaware that in about 90 seconds, I was going to destroy her entire reputation. My wife Claire squeezed my hand under the table so hard I could feel her wedding ring digging into my skin. She whispered that I didn't have to do this, that we could just leave and handle it privately. But I'd spent 18 months being called a con artist and a leech while Patricia drained our savings account, and I was done being quiet about it. I met Claire 4 years ago at a hospital fundraiser where I was working as an event coordinator and she was representing her family's pharmaceutical company. She approached me during the silent auction and asked if I knew anything about the vintage medical equipment on display, and I admitted I had no idea but would happily make up stories about each piece if that would help. She laughed, and we spent the next hour inventing elaborate fictional histories for antique stethoscopes and surgical tools. She told me later that she fell for me because I made her laugh without trying to impress her with money or connections, which apparently every other man in her social circle did constantly. I fell for her because she was genuine and kind and didn't make me feel small for having a normal middle-class background instead of a trust fund. We dated for 8 months before I met Patricia, Claire's mother. Claire kept putting it off, saying her mother was particular about who she introduced into the family, but eventually we couldn't avoid it anymore. Patricia invited us to brunch at her country club on a Sunday morning in May. I wore my best suit, which I'd bought specifically for that meeting, and still felt underdressed the moment I walked into the marble-floored entrance. Patricia was already seated when we arrived, wearing a cream-colored designer dress and pearls that probably cost more than my car. She looked me up and down for a solid 5 seconds before offering her hand, and I could see her cataloging every detail of my appearance to find something wrong. The brunch was brutal. Patricia asked about my family background, my education, my career prospects, my financial situation, all while maintaining a pleasant smile that never reached her eyes. When I explained that my parents were a public school teacher and an electrician from Ohio, Patricia said, "How quaint," in a tone that made it clear she thought it was anything but. She asked what kind of future I could provide for Claire, whether I had investments or property, if I understood the responsibilities that came with being part of their family. Claire tried to redirect the conversation multiple times, but Patricia always steered it back to my apparent inadequacies. By the time we left, I felt like I'd failed a job interview for a position I hadn't even applied for. Claire apologized the entire drive home, saying her mother was protective and would warm up once she got to know me better. I wanted to believe her, but Patricia's expression when she looked at me had been pure calculation, like she was trying to figure out exactly how much damage I could do to her daughter's life. Over the next few months, Patricia's behavior didn't improve. She called Claire constantly with articles about prenuptial agreements and stories about her friends' daughters who'd been taken advantage of by charming men with no money. She'd mention at family dinners how important it was to marry within your social class, how love wasn't enough to sustain a marriage when financial stress inevitably appeared. She never said my name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. When Claire and I got engaged after 2 years together, Patricia's campaign against me intensified. She told Claire's father that I was clearly after the family money, and they needed to protect their assets. She hired a private investigator to look into my background, which I only found out about when the investigator accidentally called my office thinking it was my home number. She tried to convince Claire to sign a prenuptial agreement that would have given me absolutely nothing if we divorced, even furniture or gifts we received together. Claire refused and told her mother that she was marrying me with or without her blessing. Patricia showed up to the wedding and smiled for photos, but I could see the hatred in her eyes every time she looked at me. The first year of marriage was relatively peaceful because Claire and I lived across the state in a different city where I'd gotten a promotion to regional events director. We saw Patricia maybe once every 2 months, and those visits were tense but manageable. Patricia would make pointed comments about our apartment being small or our furniture being cheap, but Claire always shut her down. I thought maybe we'd found a sustainable distance that would let us have our own life while maintaining some family relationship. That illusion shattered when Claire's father, Gregory, had a massive stroke in March of our 2nd year married. Gregory survived, but needed extensive rehabilitation and couldn't manage the family business anymore. Patricia was suddenly handling all the finances for Gregory's medical care, the business operations, and the family estate. Claire took a leave from her job to help her mother navigate everything, and I supported the decision completely, even though it meant financial stress for us. What I didn't know was that Patricia saw this as an opportunity to prove I was only interested in money. She started telling extended family members that I was pressuring Claire to secure her inheritance early, that I was worried Gregory's medical bills would drain the estate and leave nothing for us. None of it was true. I'd never even discussed inheritance with Claire because it felt inappropriate and morbid. The accusations spread through the family like poison. Claire's Aunt Carolyn called one evening and asked Claire point blank if I was trying to convince her to contest Gregory's medical power of attorney. Claire's cousin Stephen sent her a concerned email about protecting herself financially from a husband who might have ulterior motives. Even Gregory, when he regained some speech ability, asked Claire in a slurred voice if everything was okay with her marriage and her money. Claire defended me every single time, but I could see the stress wearing her down. She started having panic attacks and couldn't sleep through the night. The distance between us and Patricia had been protective, but now we were being pulled back into her orbit and drowning in her toxicity. 6 months after Gregory's stroke, Claire's company offered her a promotion that required relocating back to our home state, just 30 minutes from where Patricia lived. Claire was conflicted because she wanted the career opportunity, but dreaded being closer to her mother. I told her we should take it, that we couldn't let Patricia control our lives by avoiding entire geographic regions. We moved back in August and bought a small house in a suburb halfway between Claire's new office and the city where Patricia lived. The house wasn't fancy, but it was ours, purchased almost entirely with Claire's income and a small inheritance she'd received from her grandmother years before I met her. I contributed what I could from my salary, but Claire made significantly more than me, and we were both fine with that arrangement. Patricia started showing up at our house unannounced within weeks of us moving in. She'd arrive on Saturday mornings with pastries and criticism, walking through our rooms and pointing out everything that needed upgrading. She suggested we hire an interior designer, that the neighborhood wasn't quite appropriate for someone of Claire's background, that surely we could afford better furniture now that Claire had the promotion. She brought fabric samples and paint chips and names of contractors, all while implying that I was holding Claire back from the lifestyle she deserved. I started dreading weekends because I never knew when Patricia would appear at our door with her pleasant smile and poisonous suggestions. The real problem started in November when Claire gave Patricia access to one of our bank accounts to help manage some family financial matters. Gregory was still recovering, and Patricia was handling various estate issues, and Claire thought it would be easier if her mother could see our account to coordinate payments for some medical equipment we were storing at our house for Gregory's eventual return home. It was supposed to be temporary, just until they sorted out the medical logistics. I wasn't thrilled about it, but understood the reasoning. The account had about $15,000 in it, money Claire had saved over the years, plus some recent bonuses from her job. I had my own separate account for my income and personal expenses. In December, Claire checked the joint account to transfer money for our property taxes and found that $4,000 was missing. She pulled up the transaction history and saw multiple withdrawals over the previous month, each one for amounts between $300 and $800. The withdrawals had all been made at bank branches near Patricia's house during business hours on weekdays when we were both at work. Claire called her mother immediately and asked about the missing money. Patricia acted confused at first, then said she must have accidentally used the wrong account card when paying for some of Gregory's medical expenses. She promised to transfer the money back by the end of the week. The money never came back. When Claire followed up, Patricia said she'd discovered those expenses were actually Claire's responsibility according to some old family agreement, so she'd been right to use that account. Claire had never heard of any such agreement and asked to see the documentation. Patricia got defensive and said Claire was being disrespectful by questioning her mother's handling of family finances, especially when she was already stressed managing Gregory's care. The conversation ended with Patricia crying and saying she couldn't believe her own daughter would accuse her of stealing. Claire felt terrible and dropped the issue, believing maybe she'd misunderstood something about the family financial arrangements. I knew something was wrong. I'd watched Patricia manipulate situations for 3 years at that point, and this felt like another one of her games. I suggested we remove her access to the account and handle Gregory's medical expenses through a separate arrangement, but Claire said that would cause a huge family fight, and her mother was already struggling with the stress of caring for Gregory. I pushed back and said $4,000 wasn't nothing, that we needed that money. Claire got upset and said I was making this about money when her father was still partially paralyzed, and her mother was overwhelmed. I backed down because I didn't want to add to Claire's stress, but I started monitoring our accounts daily. More money disappeared in January, another $3,000, withdrawn in similar patterns. This time, when Claire confronted her, Patricia became hostile. She said Claire was being influenced by me, that I was obviously trying to isolate her from her family by creating financial paranoia. She said it was disgusting that I would use family tragedy to drive a wedge between mother and daughter. She told Claire that she'd been right about me from the beginning, that I was showing my true colors now that there was family money to grab. Claire came home from that conversation in tears, caught between believing her mother and trusting her husband. I showed her the bank statements with the withdrawal patterns highlighted, and she finally agreed something wasn't right. We went to our bank in person on a Thursday afternoon in late January. The branch manager was a woman named Evelyn Davis, who'd worked in banking for 26 years. We explained the situation and showed her the account history. Evelyn pulled up the detailed records and confirmed that all the withdrawals had been made using Patricia's card, authorized through the access Claire had granted. She showed us that Patricia had made the withdrawals at 4 different branches, always in amounts under $1,000, which wouldn't trigger automatic fraud alerts. Evelyn said the pattern looked deliberate, like someone who knew exactly how to stay under detection thresholds. Evelyn asked if we wanted to file a fraud report with the bank's security department. Claire hesitated because that felt like formally accusing her mother of theft. I said we needed to at least document what was happening before more money disappeared. Evelyn prepared a report and walked us through the process of removing Patricia's access to the account. She warned us that if Patricia had made these withdrawals intentionally without permission to use the money for personal expenses, it could be considered theft, even with authorized account access. She suggested we consult a lawyer if more money went missing. That evening, Claire's phone exploded with calls and texts from family members. Patricia had apparently told everyone that we'd accused her of stealing, that I'd convinced Claire to cut off her own mother during the most difficult time of her life, that I was systematically isolating Claire from her family to control her and her money. Claire's Aunt Carolyn called her selfish and cruel. Her cousin Stephen said I'd obviously been waiting for this chance to turn Claire against her family. Even Gregory's sister Maureen, who usually stayed out of drama, sent a long email about how disappointed she was in Claire for believing her gold-digger husband over her own mother. Claire had a complete breakdown that night. She couldn't understand how trying to protect our money had turned into being accused of elder abuse and family betrayal. I held her while she cried and told her we'd figure this out together. But privately, I was furious. Patricia had stolen $7,000 from us and somehow positioned herself as the victim when we'd simply removed her access to our account. I realized she was better at manipulation than I'd given her credit for. She wasn't just stealing money, she was stealing Claire's entire family support system. February brought more accusations, but no acknowledgement of the missing money. Patricia told everyone who would listen that I was financially abusive, that I'd convinced Claire she couldn't trust her own mother, that I was clearly planning to take control of Claire's inheritance when Gregory eventually passed away. She organized a family intervention where 8 relatives sat Claire down and told her she needed to examine her marriage and consider whether I was really good for her. Claire defended me, but came home shaking and pale, devastated that her entire family believed her mother's lies over her truth. I started documenting everything. I created a spreadsheet with every withdrawal Patricia had made, the dates, amounts, and locations. I pulled our account statements going back 2 years to show we'd never had financial problems before Patricia got access. I gathered emails and texts where Patricia had promised to return the money and then claimed she'd never made such promises. I printed everything and put it in a folder because I knew we'd need proof if this escalated further. Claire watched me organize the evidence and said it felt paranoid, like we were building a case against her own mother. I told her we were protecting ourselves against someone who'd already proven she'd lie and steal from us. In March, I discovered Patricia had somehow gotten access to Claire's credit card and charged $8,000 in purchases. Claire had gotten a notification about unusual activity and checked her account to find charges at high-end furniture stores, jewelry shops, and restaurants she'd never visited. All the charges were in the city where Patricia lived, made over the previous 6 weeks. Claire called the credit card company immediately, and they confirmed the charges were made using a physical card that Patricia must have obtained somehow. Claire remembered her mother had borrowed her purse a few months earlier, claiming she needed to find a tissue, and must have copied or taken the credit card information then. The credit card company's fraud investigator was a man named Keith Morrison, who'd been investigating financial crimes for 11 years. He reviewed the charges and told us this looked like straightforward credit card fraud. He asked if we wanted to file a police report, which would be necessary to dispute the charges. Claire started crying on the phone and said the person who used her card was her mother. Keith's voice softened, and he said he understood how difficult that was, but whether it was a stranger or a family member, unauthorized use of a credit card was still fraud. He gave us the case number and said we had 90 days to decide whether to involve law enforcement. That night, I sat Claire down and told her we needed to face reality. Her mother had now stolen $15,000 from us in 4 months. This wasn't confusion or miscommunication. This was systematic theft. Patricia had carefully planned each withdrawal and charge to avoid detection for as long as possible. She'd manipulated the family into believing we were the villains when we tried to protect ourselves. We needed to involve the police or a lawyer or both, because this was only going to get worse. Claire agreed, but said she needed a few days to process what this meant, that reporting her own mother to the police felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. Before we could decide what to do, Patricia went nuclear. She called a family meeting at her house and told everyone that I'd been secretly draining Claire's accounts and trying to frame Patricia for it. She said she had proof that I was financially controlling and had been isolating Claire from the family on purpose. She claimed I'd convinced Claire to cut her off from the bank account because I wanted sole control over the money. 23 family members attended this meeting, and Claire and I weren't invited. We only found out about it when Claire's cousin Bethany called her afterward, crying and asking how Claire could let this happen to herself. Claire demanded to see this supposed proof, and Patricia sent her a rambling 5-page document that made absolutely no sense. It included screenshots of our bank account balances from months apart, presented as if they showed me spending large amounts of money. The actual transactions were clearly labeled as Claire's purchases or our joint bills, but Patricia had highlighted random numbers and added notes claiming they proved financial abuse. She'd included photos of our house and circled items she claimed I'd bought with Claire's money, even though most of them were gifts or things Claire had purchased for herself before we even met. The document was absurd, but Patricia presented it with such confidence that people who wanted to believe her did. I hired a lawyer in April. His name was Russell Thompson, a financial attorney who'd practiced for 19 years and handled multiple cases involving family financial exploitation. I showed him everything: the bank statements, the credit card fraud report, Patricia's delusional document, the texts from family members accusing me of things I hadn't done. Russell read through it all carefully and then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He said this was one of the clearer cases of elder to adult child financial abuse he'd seen, with the twist that Patricia was neither elderly nor the victim, despite positioning herself that way. He explained that what Patricia had done was legally theft, and the credit card fraud was a criminal offense regardless of family relationship. Russell laid out our options. We could file a police report and pursue criminal charges, which might result in Patricia facing theft charges and potentially jail time. We could pursue civil litigation to recover the money, which would be a long, expensive process. We could try mediation, though Russell said he doubted Patricia would participate in good faith given her behavior pattern. Or we could cut our losses, remove Patricia from our lives completely, and accept the $15,000 as the price of learning who she really was. He said there was also a fourth option I might not like. We could expose Patricia's theft publicly to the family with undeniable documentation, forcing everyone to face the truth. That fourth option stuck in my mind. Patricia had weaponized the family against us by controlling the narrative. She'd positioned herself as the concerned mother and me as the gold-digging villain, and everyone believed her because she told the story first and loudest. If we could show them the actual evidence in a way they couldn't dismiss or ignore, maybe we could at least clear our names even if we never got the money back. Russell warned me that public confrontations rarely went the way people hoped, but if I was determined to do it, I should make sure the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. I spent 3 weeks preparing. Russell helped me organize the evidence into a clear narrative that anyone could follow. We created a timeline showing every withdrawal and charge with dates, amounts, and locations. We had bank statements showing Patricia's card was used for each transaction. We had the credit card fraud report from the company investigator. We had screenshots of Patricia's texts promising to return money and then denying she'd ever made those promises. We had her ridiculous 5-page document claiming I was stealing, with our actual bank records beside it, showing she'd completely misrepresented normal transactions. Everything was color-coded and labeled, impossible to misunderstand. The opportunity came in May when Patricia announced she was having a birthday party at an upscale restaurant to celebrate turning 62. She invited the entire extended family, 53 people, and made a point of telling everyone that Claire was welcome, but she understood if Claire's husband prevented her from attending. The emotional manipulation was blatant, but Claire said she wanted to go because she missed her family and was tired of being isolated. I told her we should both go, and we should bring the evidence. Claire was terrified of the confrontation, but agreed that we couldn't keep living under Patricia's lies. Russell advised me on exactly how to handle the public disclosure. He said to wait until Patricia made one of her pointed comments about family and money, then respond calmly with facts. Don't get emotional, don't yell, just present the evidence and let it speak for itself. He said to make copies for anyone who wanted to see the documents more closely. He warned me that Patricia would try to make a scene and paint herself as the victim, and I needed to stay calm no matter what happened. He also mentioned that if Patricia tried to claim the evidence was fabricated, we had the original bank involved and they could verify everything. The birthday party was on a Saturday evening in mid-May at a restaurant called the Heritage House that Patricia had chosen specifically because it was expensive and fancy and would remind everyone of the social class difference between her family and me. Claire and I arrived exactly on time, and I had a leather portfolio under my arm containing 54 copies of the evidence packet. We'd made one for each attendee plus extras. Claire saw the portfolio and squeezed my hand, asking one more time if I was sure about this. I told her I was sure, that I was tired of being called a gold digger by someone who'd literally stolen from us. Patricia held court at the head of a long table, wearing a burgundy dress and the diamond necklace Gregory had given her for their 30th anniversary. She saw us walk in, and her smile turned brittle, but she greeted Claire warmly and ignored me completely. We took seats near the middle of the table, surrounded by cousins and aunts and uncles who'd all heard Patricia's version of events. The atmosphere was tense. People kept glancing at me, and then looking away, and I could hear the whispers starting about whether I'd actually shown up after everything that had happened. Dinner service was painful. Patricia made several comments about how wonderful it was when family came together despite difficulties, how important it was to protect the people you loved from those who might take advantage. She talked about Gregory's recovery and how grateful she was that she'd been wise with their finances during this challenging time. She mentioned how some people married for love and others for money, and you could always tell the difference eventually. Every comment was designed to remind people that she saw me as a threat to her daughter, and I sat there cutting my steak into smaller and smaller pieces while my anger built. The toast happened during dessert. Patricia stood up with her champagne glass and started talking about family values and protecting each other and staying loyal even when outsiders tried to cause division. She looked directly at me when she said, "Outsiders." She thanked everyone for their support during Gregory's health crisis and said she didn't know what she would have done without family she could trust. Claire's hand was shaking in mine under the table. I could feel her wanting to disappear, to avoid the confrontation, to keep the peace like she'd been trained to do her whole life. I waited until Patricia finished her toast and everyone started clapping. Then I stood up, and the room went quiet. Patricia's smile froze on her face. I said I wanted to add something to the birthday celebration, that I thought it was time everyone knew the truth about family loyalty and who they could really trust. I pulled out the evidence packets from my portfolio and started passing them down the table. Patricia demanded to know what I was doing, her voice getting shrill. I said calmly that I was sharing some bank statements and credit card reports that I thought the family would find interesting. People opened the packets and started reading. I watched their faces change as they processed what they were seeing. I explained out loud, my voice steady, that over the past 6 months, Patricia had withdrawn $7,000 from our joint account without permission and charged $8,000 to Claire's credit card without authorization. I said every transaction was documented in the packets they were holding, with dates, locations, and amounts. I mentioned that we had filed a fraud report with the credit card company and that our bank had confirmed all the withdrawals were made using Patricia's card. Patricia exploded. She shouted that I was lying, that I'd fabricated these documents to turn the family against her. She said I was abusive and controlling, and this was exactly the kind of manipulation she'd been warning everyone about. She grabbed one of the packets from her sister Maureen and started ripping it up, yelling that none of it was real. I stayed calm and said that anyone who wanted to verify the information could call our bank directly, that I had the case number from the credit card fraud investigation, that we'd be happy to show original bank statements to anyone who asked. Claire stood up beside me, and her voice was stronger than I'd ever heard it. She said her mother had been stealing from us for months and lying about it to the family. She said Patricia had manipulated everyone into believing I was the problem while she systematically drained our accounts. She held up her phone and showed a text thread where Patricia had promised to return the $4,000 from December and then later claimed she'd never said that. Claire's hands were shaking, but her voice stayed firm as she told her entire family that she was done protecting her mother from the consequences of theft. Gregory, who'd been quiet all evening, asked Patricia in his slow, stroke-affected voice if what we were saying was true. Had she taken money from Claire and Nathan's accounts? Patricia started crying and said Gregory couldn't possibly believe these lies, that I'd clearly poisoned Claire against her own family. Gregory asked again, firmer this time, and Patricia's face crumpled. She said she'd borrowed some money because Gregory's medical bills were overwhelming, and she'd been planning to pay it back. She said she was going to tell us, but hadn't found the right time. She said it wasn't stealing because Claire was her daughter, and what's hers was essentially family money anyway. The room erupted. Claire's Aunt Carolyn was staring at the bank statements with a horrified expression. Cousin Stephen was adding up the transaction amounts on his phone. Bethany was crying and apologizing to Claire for believing Patricia's lies. Gregory's sister Maureen looked absolutely devastated, staring at Patricia like she'd never seen her before. The restaurant manager appeared asking if everything was all right because multiple people were shouting at once. I sat down and let the chaos unfold around me, feeling strangely calm now that the truth was finally public. Patricia tried to leave, but Gregory told her to sit down, his voice commanding despite the slight slur. He asked her directly how much money she'd taken in total. Patricia claimed it was only a few thousand for medical expenses. Claire said no, it was $15,000, and none of it went to medical expenses because all of Gregory's care was covered by insurance and their savings. Claire pulled up the credit card charges on her phone and read them out loud. $3,000 at a furniture store, $1,800 at a jewelry shop, $400 at a spa, multiple restaurant charges at places Patricia frequented with her friends. None of it was medical expenses. All of it was Patricia treating herself to luxuries while framing me as the gold digger. Russell had told me to bring business cards for our bank manager and the credit card fraud investigator, so people could verify the information independently if they doubted us. I pulled them out and set them on the table, saying anyone who wanted to confirm what we'd presented could contact these people directly. Patricia screamed that I'd orchestrated this whole thing to humiliate her at her own birthday party. I looked at her calmly and said she'd spent 6 months humiliating me and Claire by calling me a gold digger while literally stealing from us. I said she'd poisoned the family against us with lies, and we'd simply corrected the record with facts. The evening disintegrated from there. Patricia locked herself in the restaurant bathroom crying while Gregory sat at the table looking 10 years older than he had an hour earlier. Various family members came up to Claire and me apologizing for believing Patricia, saying they should have asked us directly what was happening. Carolyn was particularly distraught because she'd said horrible things to Claire based on Patricia's lies. Several people asked if we were pressing charges, and I said we hadn't decided yet, but we'd consulted a lawyer about our options. When Patricia finally emerged from the bathroom, Gregory told her they needed to leave and have a serious conversation. His voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. Patricia tried one more time to claim she'd been planning to pay us back, that this was all a misunderstanding. Gregory cut her off and said taking $15,000 without asking wasn't borrowing, it was stealing, and he was ashamed of her. Patricia looked around the room for someone to defend her and found no one. Every single person was staring at her with some combination of shock, anger, or disappointment. She grabbed her purse and walked out, and Gregory followed her, slowly using his cane. Claire and I left about 20 minutes later after talking to several family members who wanted to understand what had really been happening. Bethany hugged Claire and cried, apologizing over and over for the intervention and for believing Patricia's version of events. Stephen asked if there was anything he could do to help, and I said, just believe us when we tell them what's happening in our lives instead of assuming the worst. We drove home in silence, both of us too emotionally exhausted to process what had just happened. The next morning, Gregory called Claire. He'd spent the entire night talking to Patricia and looking at their own financial records. He'd discovered she'd also been taking money from his accounts, small amounts he hadn't noticed because he trusted her to manage their finances while he recovered. He estimated she'd taken close to $40,000 from him in addition to what she'd stolen from us. He was filing for separation and had already contacted his lawyer about protecting his assets. He apologized to Claire for not believing her sooner, for letting Patricia manipulate the family narrative, for not being the father she deserved while he was focused on his own recovery. Patricia made one last attempt to control the story. She sent a mass email to the entire family claiming she'd been financially supporting us for months, and we'd turned on her when she asked for repayment. She said the bank statements were taken out of context and that she'd only used our accounts because we'd asked her to help manage our bills during a difficult time. The email was desperate and incoherent, contradicting itself multiple times. Several family members forwarded it to Claire asking what Patricia was talking about because it made no sense compared to the documented evidence we'd shown at the birthday party. We never got the $15,000 back. Patricia claimed she'd spent it all and had no way to repay us. Russell said we could sue her in civil court, but the legal fees would likely exceed what we'd recover. We decided to let it go financially, but pressed charges for the credit card fraud because that had concrete evidence and we wanted there to be some legal consequence. The credit card company's investigation led to Patricia being charged with fraudulent use of a credit card, a felony in our state. She ended up pleading guilty to a reduced misdemeanor charge and was ordered to pay restitution to the credit card company, though Claire and I never saw any of that money. The family split almost evenly down the middle. About half believed the evidence we'd presented and cut Patricia off, or seriously limited contact with her. The other half decided we'd been too harsh in how we'd exposed her, that family problems should be handled privately, that embarrassing her at her birthday party was cruel regardless of what she'd done. Claire lost relationships with several relatives who thought we'd gone too far. I pointed out that we'd only gone public after 6 months of trying to handle it privately, while Patricia systematically destroyed our reputation. Gregory followed through on the separation and eventually divorced Patricia. He split everything 50-50 as required by their state's laws, but he made sure she couldn't access any of his accounts ever again. He apologized to me personally for believing Patricia's characterization of me as a gold digger, said he'd been recovering from a stroke and not thinking clearly, but that wasn't an excuse for not giving me the benefit of the doubt. He told me I was good for Claire, and he was grateful she'd found someone who would stand up for her even when it meant confronting the whole family. That conversation meant more to me than I expected. Claire and I are still together, living in the same house Patricia used to criticize. We changed banks entirely and set up new accounts with passwords and security Patricia could never access. We limited contact with the relatives who sided with Patricia, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Claire still grieves the loss of the mother she thought she had, the one who would protect her instead of steal from her. She's in therapy working through the betrayal and the guilt she feels for exposing her own mother's crimes. I remind her that we didn't commit the crimes. We just refused to keep pretending they didn't happen. Patricia occasionally tries to contact Claire with messages that alternate between apologetic and accusatory. She'll send a text saying she's sorry and wants to make things right, then follow it up an hour later with an email about how we destroyed her life and turned her family against her. Claire doesn't respond anymore. She told me that the woman who sent those messages isn't her mother, or rather, is exactly who her mother always was, beneath the performance of respectability. That's a hard truth to accept about your own parent. I still have the leather portfolio with all the evidence. Sometimes I look through it and remember standing up in that restaurant with my heart pounding, knowing I was about to blow up Claire's entire family, but also knowing we couldn't survive another day under Patricia's lies. I don't regret it. People told me I should have handled it privately, should have protected Patricia's dignity, should have considered the family consequences. But we'd tried private approaches for 6 months, and they'd only made things worse. Sometimes the only way to stop someone from destroying you is to show everyone exactly what they've been doing. The hardest part wasn't the confrontation itself. It was the months afterward, watching Claire mourn the relationship she'd thought she had with her mother. Watching her realize that Patricia had been manipulating and using her probably for years before I appeared and became a convenient scapegoat. Claire keeps discovering new lies as she looks back at her childhood and young adulthood with clearer eyes. The theft was just one symptom of a much deeper pattern of control and exploitation. We're rebuilding our life around people who actually care about us, rather than what we can provide them. We're more careful about who we trust with access to our finances and our private information. And we don't tolerate people who try to paint us as villains for protecting ourselves. If that makes us difficult or unforgiving by some people's standards, I'm fine with that. I learned from Patricia that sometimes the people who scream loudest about family loyalty are the ones most willing to betray it when it serves them. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.